right, guys, today we are going to look at assignment 7.1.2. I'm going to explain it in full detail. This will be a two-part video because there is a lot of information. All right, guys, so we are on the first page of it. In this assignment, you will be able to pull from a presentation to add it to a timeline and then write a summary. So we're going to click open the assignment down below. We're going to open it up and we're going to be going through this presentation and answering these questions together as best as we can. All right, once you are done with filling out the timeline of events, fill out the summary template at the end. You will be writing a claim with evidence. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a video going through this presentation, answering and filling and helping fill out this timeline, not completely, but a little bit. And then we'll have a second video to go over the timeline template, the summary template for the Russian Revolution background, right? So a lot of information. So get ready. All right, guys, so we are on this slideshow and let's go ahead and get started. So this is a picture of Vladimir Lenin with the Russian workers. Let's do a little bit of background. So in the 19th century, which means the 1800s, Russia was a vast empire controlled by the Romanov dynasty. A dynasty is when a control of a country is passed from family member to family member for centuries. Russia was relatively isolated from the affairs of Western Europe and were a strongly agricultural country who still relied on the principles of serfdom to plant crops. Now, what this really is saying is that Russia had rulers, and they were put there like a monarchy. It was family member, and they were all about agriculture, and they relied on rich people holding the land and then having other people work the land, basically as slaves on their land. Now I'm going to go over to this timeline, and if you notice, as you read over the presentation, you're going to complete the chart or timeline of events. So the 19th century Russia we just spoke about, I want you to go ahead and put that in your own words, what we just spoke about. And you could use my words if you want to for this one, but I want you to describe it in your own words. And I'll pause, or you can pause while we are doing that. All right, we're back on the presentation. Tsar, this is how you pronounce that word. You pronounce it, you don't pronounce the T. So it's Tsar Nicholas II takes control of the country in 1894. Here's a picture of Tsar Nicholas II. He was in charge from 1894 to 1917. Notice how 1917 is during World War I. All right, so Tsar, meaning King, Nicholas II had ruled Russia as Tsar since the death of his father in 1894. Like his father, Nicholas wanted an autocratic rule in which he alone made all the laws and determined all foreign policy. Nicholas increased industrial production in Russia, but at the same time created a larger class of urban poor. Most people in Russia, however, still lived on farms. So what is it saying here? So he took over and he wanted to be an autocrat, which means he was completely in charge. No people voting, none of that. He was in charge of everything as far as laws and the dealings with other countries. He did increase production in industries, but it really just it got the country more rich as far as the Tsar more rich, but the people weren't being taken care of. And because the country was so large, most of the people still lived on farms. So I'm going to go over here, and I want you to write what we just learned about what was going on in 1894 in your own words, and go ahead and pause this to do so. All right, our next slide is Bloody Sunday, which was January 9th of 1905. So the urban poor worker worked in factories for long hours, horrible conditions, and little pay. We've already learned a lot about the Industrial Revolution, and we can definitely say that we know that the urban poor were not treated very well, and they were not going to be treated well in Russia as well. So in 1905, they asked the Tsar for help by presenting a petition to the Winter Palace. The Tsar was not at home, and his generals ordered the troops to open fire on the people. Over 500 unarmed people were killed in an incident that became known as Bloody Sunday. The Tsar was forced to give up some of his powers to a legislative branch called the Dumas. Now, what this is saying is that they picketed and they petitioned, they were protesting at the palace where the Tsar resided or lived, but he wasn't home, and so the generals fired on the people and had the soldiers fire. Not all of the soldiers were going to fire, but there were going to be a significant amount that do. Now, here's a picture of Bloody Sunday, and what we can see is that did I miss an entire slide? I did. I missed an entire slide. Let's finish up this slide and then I'll go back and talk about it. So they were unhappy, and these are the reasons why they are unhappy. So we'll go over that in a second. But they were going to be fired upon, and so the Tsar had to give some concessions after this incident, and they created a law-making body. So legislative branch means people who can make laws, or the people that get to be voted in elections and to make laws. Now let's see why they were unhappy. So around the turn of the century, so like 5 years later, basically, for years the Russian people had been dissatisfied with this ruling family. Two groups in particular, the serfs, which are the peasants, and the working class. So the serfs made up about 85% of the population. They were slaves until they were freed in 1861. Yet 50 years later, their property still tied them to their wealthy landowners. This is very similar to what is going to be going on in the United States with slaves and sharecropping. So there's a connection there, and almost the same exact time, except the United States was in 1865. So very few were allowed to own land of their own. For a decade, Russia's cities had been disabled by strikes. Factory workers were emerging as the newest social class, and these workers demanded better wages and working conditions. So new political parties came. This is a very important part of this. The new political parties came out of this unrest. The Bolshevik Party, notice how it's in red because it's very important, led by Vladimir Lenin, he's very important, was formed in 1912 and was the most ambitious revolutionary party at the time. So let's go back, and we're going to do a twofold here. So the turn of the century is going to be talking about, if you don't put Bolshevik Party in this one, then that's not going to be good. And the 1905 Bloody Sunday. Go ahead and pause and come back to this. All right, now let's head into 1915. So World War I complicates things. By 1915, World War I was in full swing, and Tsar Nicholas leaves his wife in charge of the broken country and takes command of the Russian army. Russian troops were not as strong as the Western European industrial nations of Germany and Austria. Over 15 million men were drafted into the Russian army from farms and factories. And by 1917, Russia had lost 6 million of them. The war went badly with many Russian casualties. Most Russian soldiers fought without guns. What guns they had were taken from dead Russian and German soldiers. They also took boots because Russia had none to give its men. At home, citizens were becoming more and more upset and angry over the deaths of their sons and fathers. Food, coal, and other supplies for survival were in desperate need for the people. All right, come in here and see that you have 1915, and we're going to be talking about the treatment of these soldiers. Let's move on to March Revolution of 1917. With Nicholas leading the war, the situation in St. Petersburg, which is the place where the royal family lived, grew more and more serious. Workers began to strike and soldiers began to desert their posts, leaving. Politicians from all over the world advised Nicholas to begin reform movements or change and bring democratic change to Russia, but Nicholas ignored them. Rioters were breaking into stores to steal food and supplies, and troops refused to keep order and joined the rioters. Eventually, the Tsar's wife and children were held prisoner. Faced with this, the Tsar was finally forced to abdicate his throne, which means give up his power. Let's go ahead and jump over to March 1917 and talk about that right here. Here is a picture of him abdicating his throne. Now let's look at the spring. The provisional government takes over. So provisional means temporary. When Nicholas abdicated the throne, leaders of the revolution attempted to set up a provisional or temporary government led by socialist Alexander Kerensky. Their intent was to set up a government based upon the democratic principles of the Western world. The Dumas was the governing body, and new leaders were elected. The people were still demanding more food, land and reform, and an end to the war and better working conditions. Despite their good intentions, however, the provisional government was struggling to keep control, and the Tsar and his family were kept under house arrest. So at this time, the provisional government, this temporary government, was in control, but they still did not have the same abilities of control that they would have liked. And they were trying to set up a democratic body, but it was because of how poor everything was and the conditions of everything, it was really hard for this to take hold. So let's go ahead and jump over here and tell us what exactly is going on in the spring of 1917. Now let's look at the October Revolution of 1917. So all of this is really going on there's a lot that goes on in 1917. And so here we have, with the provisional government struggling, so with that temporary government struggling, Vladimir Lenin from the Bolshevik Party saw this as a chance to take control with communism. They promised war-torn Russians the three things needed most: peace, land, and bread. And in October of 1917, Lenin and his followers began to take over St. Petersburg. The Bolsheviks faced little opposition in taking over government buildings, so they didn't really have that much to overpower. The provisional government quickly collapsed and its leaders fled the city. So jump over here, pause me, and answer and summarize what happened in October of 1917. Now we're going to talk about communism a little bit more than just in this, but it'll be in the next unit or so. The Bolsheviks began taking charge of Russia let me go back. Lenin's communist reforms. So these are the changes that Lenin made with communism that started in November of 1917. So the Bolsheviks began taking charge of Russia, instituting communism. So Lenin ended the war with Germany. So he signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Along with peace, Lenin was also made good his promise of land reform. So he took away land and divided up estates owned by Russia's wealthy landowners and gave it to the peasants. He also seized banks and industry to be run by the Bolshevik communist government. So now all of the industries, all of the banks, everything was given to the government and taken by the government and ran by the government. Immediately, a civil war from 1917 to 1922 began between the Red Bolshevik Army and the White Anti-Bolshevik Army, supported by the anti-communist European countries and the United States. So during this time, you're going to see even more of their people dying. So go ahead and head over here and talk about what's going on in November. So just a month, a lot of unrest, and it's going to last for 5 years. All right, in July of 1918, we see when the Bolsheviks did take power in October of 1917, talk of putting Nicholas on trial increased. Fearful that the White Army was advancing to set Nicholas free, the royal family was moved again and finally ended up in the town of Ekaterinburg in 1918. With word of a White Army rescue, Nicholas and his family were awakened in the middle of the night, moved to the basement, and shot. Their bodies were burned with acid and thrown down a well, and the Romanov dynasty was no longer a threat to Russian communism. Go ahead and pause this video and summarize what was just said. Tsar Nicholas, with his wife, Tsarina Alex, and children Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, shot multiple times by Bolshevik firing squad. Very sad. Now we have the creation of the United Soviet Socialist Republic, or the USSR, in 1922. Led by Vladimir Lenin, Russia was expanded to include several smaller territories surrounding Russia. The country is organized by Soviets, or territories within Russia. The word Soviet represented the workers' union in Russia, and the Bolshevik Party changed their name to the Communist Party. The country adopted the name United Soviet Socialist Republic, or USSR, as a sign of their commitment to communist ideas. People also called this the Soviet Union. Here is the flag of the communist Russia with a hammer and a sickle. And go ahead and put that for 1922. All right, guys, part 1 of this series is over. Please head on to the next one after you have finished that timeline and learn how to do the summary.